hours of a tense January morning, the world woke up to a headline that felt less like breaking news and more like a chapter torn from a Cold War novel. The United States had launched a decisive operation in Venezuela, and Nicolás Maduro, the country's long-standing president, was no longer in power. Within hours, images flooded global media, blurred satellite photos of smoke over Caracas, rushed statements from Washington, stunned reactions from Latin America, and a silence from Venezuela's state television that spoke louder than words. At the center of it all stood Donald Trump, once again dominating the global news cycle, reshaping foreign policy through confrontation, spectacle, and unapologetic force. For years, Venezuela had been a pressure point in American politics, a symbol of ideological conflict and humanitarian collapse. Under Maduro, the country's economy crumbled, millions fled, and oil production, once the lifeblood of the nation, fell into disrepair. Successive U.S. administrations used sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and support for opposition figures to weaken the regime, but none succeeded in removing it. Trump, however, had long argued that these methods were insufficient. He framed Venezuela not just as a failed state, but as a direct threat, an alleged hub for narco-trafficking, corruption, and hostile foreign influence. When he returned to the White House, it became clear that Venezuela would no longer remain a frozen conflict on the margins of U.S. foreign policy. The operation itself was swift, overwhelming, and controversial. U.S. officials described it as a targeted enforcement action tied to long-standing criminal indictments against Maduro and senior members of his government. Critics immediately labeled it a de facto regime change war. What could not be denied was its impact. Maduro was captured, flown to the United States, and placed into federal custody, a moment without precedent in modern international relations. A sitting head of state, removed not by internal uprising or international tribunal, but by direct military action from a foreign power. Trump addressed the nation later that day, speaking with the confidence and defiance that defined his political career. He framed the intervention as necessary, legal, and overdue. According to him, Venezuela had become a criminal enterprise masquerading as a government, and the United States had simply enforced the law. He promised stability, order, and a transition toward what he called real democracy. To supporters, it was strength finally applied where weakness had failed. To critics, it was an extraordinary abuse of power that shattered norms of sovereignty and international law. Inside Venezuela, confusion turned quickly into fear and uncertainty. With Maduro gone, power structures that had been held together by loyalty, coercion, and military control began to fracture. Some political prisoners were released, a gesture interpreted by some as a sign of hope and by others as an attempt to calm unrest. Armed groups loyal to the old regime retreated or went underground, while opposition leaders cautiously emerged, unsure whether they were witnessing liberation or the beginning of occupation. Ordinary Venezuelans, exhausted by years of crisis, inflation, and shortages, watched events unfold with a mix of disbelief and guarded optimism. Oil, as always, loomed over every decision. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet years of mismanagement and sanctions had reduced production to a fraction of its potential. Trump made no secret of his interest in reversing that decline. In meetings with American energy executives, he argued that stabilizing Venezuela was not just a moral imperative, but an economic opportunity. Reviving oil production, he claimed, would lower global energy prices, reduce reliance on hostile suppliers, and bring Venezuela back into the global economy under new management. Was this about justice and security, or about oil and power? Supporters insisted the two were inseparable. A stable Venezuela, they argued, required economic recovery, and oil was the only realistic engine for that recovery. Opponents countered that resource interests had always shaped foreign interventions, often with devastating consequences for local populations. They warned that promises of temporary control had a way of becoming long-term entanglements. In Washington, the political response was immediate and divided. Some lawmakers praised Trump for decisive leadership, calling the operation a victory against authoritarianism and transnational crime. Others moved quickly to reassert congressional authority, advancing resolutions to limit further military action without explicit approval. The debate was not just about Venezuela. It was about the balance of power in the American system. How much authority did a president have to reshape the world by force? Internationally, reactions ranged from cautious endorsement to outright condemnation. Several Latin American governments expressed concern that the intervention undermined regional stability and revived memories of U.S. interventions from the 20th century. Others, particularly those hostile to Maduro, quietly welcomed his removal while avoiding public alignment with Washington. China and Russia, both with strategic and economic interests in Venezuela, criticized the action and warned of broader geopolitical consequences. The United Nations called for restraint, dialogue, and respect for international law, even as events on the ground moved faster than diplomacy could follow. For Trump, the Venezuela operation fit neatly into a broader worldview. He believed in spheres of influence, hard borders, and transactional diplomacy. In his narrative, the United States had tolerated chaos in its hemisphere for too long. Venezuela was not an isolated case, but a message, a demonstration that the rules had changed. Whether that message would deter instability or provoke it remained an open question. The human cost, meanwhile, continued to unfold. Reports emerged of civilians caught between rival factions, of shortages exacerbated by uncertainty, of families unsure whether to flee or stay. U.S. citizens in Venezuela were urged to leave amid fears of reprisals and lawlessness. Aid organizations struggled to operate in a rapidly shifting environment. The promise of liberation clashed with the reality of disruption, reminding the world that even swift interventions leave long shadows. As days passed, the initial shock gave way to analysis. Commentators debated whether this moment marked the beginning of a new era in U.S. foreign policy or an unsustainable gamble driven by one man's instincts. Supporters pointed to the apparent collapse of Maduro's regime as proof that strength worked. Critics warned that removing a leader was far easier than building a stable successor, and that history was littered with examples of interventions that succeeded tactically but failed strategically. Venezuela now stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain and heavily influenced by external power. Would it move toward genuine self-determination? Would oil wealth finally translate into prosperity for its people, or once again be captured by elites? And for the United States, would this intervention be remembered as a bold correction to decades of failed policy, or as a dangerous overreach that eroded the very order it claimed to defend? For a YouTube news channel, this story is not just about Trump or Venezuela. It is about power in the modern world, how it is used, justified, resisted, and remembered. The days following the intervention blurred together in a strange mixture of urgency and waiting. In Caracas, time seemed suspended between what had been and what might come next. Government buildings stood guarded by unfamiliar forces, some wearing Venezuelan uniforms, others clearly not. The symbols of the old regime were still visible, portraits, slogans, murals, but their meaning had shifted overnight. What once represented authority now felt like relics, reminders of a power structure that had collapsed faster than anyone expected. Radios buzzed with rumors, social media overflowed with speculation, and in homes across the country, people whispered the same question: what happens now? In Washington, the answer appeared deceptively simple. The administration spoke of transition, stabilization, and partnership. Trump's advisors emphasized that the United States did not seek permanent control, only order. They described a roadmap that included securing infrastructure, restoring oil production, organizing elections, and dismantling criminal networks. On paper, it sounded decisive and orderly. In reality, each step carried risks that no briefing could fully capture. Stabilization required force. Elections required legitimacy. Economic recovery required trust. And trust, in a country scarred by decades of broken promises, was in dangerously short supply. Trump himself remained at the center of the narrative, amplifying his role through speeches and statements that left little room for ambiguity. He framed the operation as personal resolve translated into national action. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where institutions stalled, he moved ahead. This framing resonated deeply with his supporters, who saw Venezuela as proof that American power, when unapologetically used, could still shape outcomes. They pointed to the speed of the regime's collapse as evidence that deterrence had returned. Strength in this telling was clarity. Yet beneath the confident rhetoric, the administration faced immediate challenges. Venezuelan oil infrastructure was in worse condition than many anticipated. Refineries required massive investment, pipelines leaked, and skilled workers had long since emigrated.